There's a problem with doing more recent vessels on any channel. People were alive. And why is that a problem? Well, that is why even I, who PhD technically in war studies, naval historian, but PhDs from War Studies Department of King's College on Lawton team, or unit, I think it's called now. Even I approach with trepidation. Because you have to be careful of three things. One, some of the systems are close enough to modern day that their successors, or successors' are still relevant. And so you have to be careful what you say about them and how much detail you go into them. Honestly, as a rule, this is where I tend to cross-check with Wikipedia. Why do I cross-check with Wikipedia on modern ships? Because if it's on Wikipedia, it's not secret. And if I keep to the stats which are on Wikipedia, if anyone comes to me and goes, where have you been reading information? What have you been talking about? Have you been using any of your contacts? Have you got this information from this person or this person? Have they been feeding information? I can go and can honestly respond, no one's given me any information. I haven't used anything which isn't public available or isn't actually visible on Wikipedia. Therefore, if you are that worried, why don't you employ someone decent to edit Wikipedia? That is a small part of the problem with the nuclear cruisers, but the versions of them which were going to have Aegis fitted never got it. There again, the idea of Aegis system being backed up by this sheer amount of power which can be pumped through if you have nuclear reactors as your power supply. Well, we've all heard that the radars have the ability, I think the joke goes, to give pilots, if they focus, especially helicopter pilots, if they focus the beams enough, FLKs, code for funny looking kids. One of the things you learn if you hang around the armed forces, they have a very certain sense of humour, especially when it comes to naming things. You'd have to really focus that though, and honestly, you probably cause enough trouble with a radar beam that you might cause damage to the helicopter before you've actually led to that, but, you know, we'll see how that one happen. But you add the sheer energy you can get off a reactor to that phased array, you can be talking a virtually unmatchable capability in terms of power. That's a very, very strong radar. But that's not the other problem, really, with modern warships, is it? The other problem with modern warships is they then feed into existing political debates. Nuclear-powered ships feed into the ongoing energy debate, because there is a debate over energy independence versus energy supplies, green energy, what constitutes green energy, all those different groups, all those different factions fighting for attention, all those different viewpoints. There was this joke said by President Bartlett on the West Wing once. Two politicians are debating. One shouts at the other, "You're lying!" The other responds, "Yes, but at least you made a courtesy of hearing me out." Politicians actually, if you check, rarely lie. What they do is they tell a variant of the truth. They select facts, figures, statistics. After all, lies, damn lies, and statistics go hand in hand as a phraseology with politics so often that we almost might be interchangeable. This gets into the debate. Then you have the scenario that you have for America, for these ships. America is already a fractured nation at this point. They already have Vietnam, all those other issues building up. You have the fear of the defense industrial complex, the military industrial complex, and that's gone back a long way. Eisenhower had spoken about that, and presidents prior to him had also had significant worries and mentioned it. So that leads to another layer of politics being added into the debate. The whole anti-defense spending, why are we spending money, why are we wasting money on defense, we don't want to fight a war, we don't need to fight a war, there won't be a war sort of scenario, especially post-Cold War, post-1991, where things can be selectively picked upon to point out the expense. Then you have internal debates going on, where people see restricting budgets and immediately they act to defend their own. And naval officers of all kinds, we would love to believe they're above the level that they won't be ordered around, that they will stand up for what's true always and defend the best option for their service and go down fighting. But if they think that if they go down fighting, the politicians will still do that what they fear anyway, that their only chance to try and get the best possible options they can out of what's being faced is to stay, they will keep their mouth shut. They will agree with the politician publicly, back them up, because that's what they think is the best option to try and protect what they can. And finally, the other problem, as I said at the beginning, is people are still alive. Lots of people were around then. Lots of people had their own views. They had their views from what they saw on the news that day, or what they half remember from conversations they heard long ago, from discussions. And this all makes it kind of an interesting area to get into. And this is where it becomes very attractive to be a non-public facing historian. It really does. Because if you're just debating this in, well, in textbooks or journal articles, then it'll be a very respectful, moderate, slow debate. You won't get slagged off. You won't hear any nasty words. You won't have people accusing you of various things. It's just going to be a moderate debate, and it's going to be quite, easy to deal with. It's going to be very controlled. But that means the debate gets even further away from the public, which means the public are even less well informed as a result. Doesn't sit well with me. It leads to actually also siloism within academia, which I do notice a lot. The amount of times I hear from various points of people, oh, well, you're looking at them with a very Western naval doctrine or Western naval view, and I sit there and look at them and go, are you sure about that? Because there are some things about the sea which are immutable. There are some points about operations at sea which doesn't matter what your cultural, ethnic, or background is at all. The sea is out to kill you. There are certain rules of the sea which are immutable. And if you have this honest belief that some people are sea peoples who view the sea in this way and some people are not, then I think it's you who has the problem. Now, some people use that phraseology well. I have to admit, not everyone who goes, well, that's a very Western sort of doctrine will go, not everyone I'll go, well, possibly, but there again, you're precluding them from thinking that way because you're assuming they don't have the same needs or aims. That's fine. It's when you sort of go, well, they're not going to build large oceanic ships, they're only doing it for this, that, the other, for short range, and you sort of go, have you looked at their operations? Have you looked at what they're doing? These things can all turn into vicious fights. US nuclear cruisers is one of those topics. I will say now that I am sure there'll be a number of people who will put comments below this video. Variations of the reasons nuclear cruisers and nuclear surface vessels, surface escorts were got rid of was that they were too expensive. And to an extent, I can't really argue with that. Apart from, if they'd been so expensive, how come the US Navy had been operating them for 30 years? Let's change the phraseology. It's not they're too expensive, it's they're too expensive to justify against the peace dividend. There is no surprise that the vast majority of ships, if you look at their years of decommissioning, the first go 1993, 1994, some then go in 1995, 1996, 1997, 1998, and the last two in 1999. They all go in the 1990s. The peace dividend. And yes, the argument is made they're too expensive to operate, it's too expensive to operate them. But that's not the whole sentence, is it? It's not they're too expensive to operate. It's they're too expensive to operate under current conditions where we don't think we're actually going to have to fight a peer war, so we don't see the point in retaining this capability, despite the fact in a peer war it would have been very useful. But there isn't going to be a peer war, as we're now the unadulterated, glorious power of the world. The world all bows down to America. Why do we need to maintain this capability? And for those wondering, Iron Brew is non-alcoholic. But think about something which is bright orange and has, I think, broadly speaking, twice the caffeine and sugar that Coke has. Doesn't really need alcohol. These are the nuclear cruisers of the US Navy. And I know, I have the orange ones mark the class leads. And that tells you something, that there are 9 vessels and 5 classes. Long Beach, Bainbridge, Truxtun, California, South Carolina, Virginia, Texas, Mississippi, Arkansas. Some of those vessels serve 30 years. Texas, 15 years and 10 months and 6 days. That ship was barely worn in. You can also see there is a pattern to their construction. The US Navy builds free. And we have to consider what they're building at that time. They're building the USS Enterprise. CVN 65, built 1958 to 1961. You're going to need some escorts to look after her, aren't you? You're going to need some escorts to take care of her. She's nuclear powered. She's big and capable. But if we think about it, the Nimitzes don't start to come into service till the mid-1970s. Again, you've got nuclear carriers coming into service, and well, oh good lord, the next batch of nuclear escorts start to appear. California, South Carolina, Virginia, Texas, and Mississippi. 74, 75, 76, 77, 78. Nimitz, commissioned 75. Dwight D. Eisenhower, commissioned 77. Carl Vincent, 1982. Arkansas, 1980. And then they have plans for more nuclear cruisers after them. A fifth Virginia was planned and cancelled. So why? Why are they building nuclear cruisers? Because if you want to get the best out of your nuclear-powered carrier, and by best I mean the strategic best, not the fighting best. Operationally, in a fleet operation in a theatre, once it's in the theatre, you can probably supply it and with escorts, which are conventionally powered, which can keep up with it. But the real thing comes if you want to move escorts around. If you want to do something like this. Because, let's be honest, the figures on Wikipedia for the top speeds of these ships, which I've made a few jokes about in the various videos, do not make sense at all. So they are more than likely baloney. They're kind of like the figures which US Submarine Service, the Royal Navy Submarine Service, all things give for their nuclear-powered submarines and the nuclear-powered carriers. If we consider the wonderful Enterprise, her top speed, listed on Wikipedia, is 33.6 knots, which apparently she achieved thanks to 8 Westinghouse A2W nuclear reactors, 4 Westinghouse geared steam turbines supplying 4 shafts with 280,000 shaft horsepower. Now, I do admit, things change. And that is a very big, that is a full 94,781 metric tons full loaded hull. But I doubt the top speed when she was new was 33.6 knots. But the other thing I would point out about it is that's 33.6 knots without having to stop to refuel. She will keep that up. She is never going to stop. So you could run her on that speed from the Pacific to the Atlantic if you had to. If the Panama Canal is blocked, if the Suez Canal is blocked and you have to get round fast, you can do it at full speed and your carrier can appear where people weren't sure it was. But your conventional escorts won't keep up. You don't need many of the nuclear escorts, because when you're going at that speed, the amount of things which can actually intercept you and actually stand a chance are very few. Because, let's put it this way, if you are doing 35, 30 plus knots, the submarine either has to be lying perfectly in front of you, or it has to move to try and intercept you. If you're going at that fast, the odds are, unless it's very close already, it's going to have to move fairly fast to catch you, in which case it's going to make a lot of noise. Because submarines, once they have to go fast, make a lot of noise. The whole point about a submarine being this super predator of the seas is a great thing, up until you make them move fast underwater. And then everyone goes, oh, there's a submarine. Hello, meet the helicopter. So, nuclear-powered escorts are about giving these things, these nuclear-powered carriers, strategic mobility. They're not about providing the fighting power of the task group. They're really not. That's going to be your conventional force. But the idea that seemed to be going about was you wanted to have a 1 to 2 at least, preferably 2 to 3, that you could make sure were available if you needed to move a carrier rapidly. And the odds were you weren't going to need to move many carriers like that. But if you did need to move a carrier like that, you were going to really need to move it. And the only scenario where you were going to have that situation turn up was in a peer war. And especially in a peer war if you're thinking about it being more than a quick bang nuclear war. The moment you start to think about, and that's the interesting thing, because of course they stop, the nuclear carriers, they stop and they pause and they're taking everything into account and they're thinking it all through, and you've got Rickover doing his thing, which is basically submarines. All the future of warfare is submarines, and he wins the argument. By the way, in the 1990s, that's part of the reason he's won. Rickover has won the battle. Submarines are the future. Submarines, submarines. Everything's going to be submarines. And it's, again, because, you know, you can afford to start looking and thinking like that and thinking one-dimensionally when you don't really have to fight. When you just have to have the image of capability, not the reality of capability, you can afford to think one-dimensionally. Because submarines, as effective and brilliant they are, I'm not saying they're not. But if you put all your eggs in the submarine basket, then your enemy has the job of just working out how to defeat your submarines. And that won't be an easy task, but it's a lot easier to focus all your resources on just having to defeat the submarines than it is to figure out how to defeat the submarines, the carrier battle groups, the amphibious task groups, the whole panoply, the heavy long-range strategic bombers, the army teams which come in, the marine teams, the whole lot. If I only have to defeat one thing, that is a far easier task than having to defeat everything. As complicated as it is a far easier task you present me. It's also a far easier task if I can predict exactly what I'm going to be facing. Especially if I can start to limit it off. Because let's be honest, the Achilles heel of US Navy strategic mobility is the Panama Canal. It's a fixed in place. Why is the Soviet Union prepared to do all it is to try and bend over backwards for Cuba? Not just because it's close to the United States and really winds them up and can allow them to do really nasty things to the Americans in terms of their ego and their security, but also it offers a potential to strike the Panama Canal. It's a 2-for-1. It allows you to strike the United States and strike the ability of the United States to mobilize its forces and bring them together. Now, I've included these ships and the cruisers, but judging by the comments, I need to get into this discussion. So, I need to talk about 1975 ship reclassification. There are various debates on what goes where and how things get changed, but let's broadly explain it. There are some reasons. In 1974, it's felt as a cruiser gap with the Soviet Union. This, of course, is complete and utter politics. Complete and utter politics, based on the fact the US Navy calls their cruiser-sized ships frigates because... Let me put it this way, okay? So the US Navy post-World War II are building these destroyer leaders, which they designate as destroyer leaders, hence they call them DLs. But they don't want to call them destroyer leaders because that's boring. They start thinking about, well, we're the coming Navy. We're the Navy of the world now. What ships did the Royal Navy used to use as their present ships when they were a Navy of the world in their heyday? What were they? They were frigates. What ships did we have that were key to, you know, Constellation, all these things, Old Ironside? They're frigates. So we're going to call them frigates and bring back the luster of the Age of Sail. Okay, fine. You want to call them frigates? Call them frigates. No one really cares. But this creates a problem because in 1974, some Twinkerbell does a study that goes into Congress and causes a complete panic because it turns out they don't include gun cruisers in this category at all. The Soviet Union has 19 missile cruisers in service and 7 building. 19 and 7! The US Navy has only 6. Even worse, the US Navy's frigates are outnumbered 3-1. Or something like that. You're just going to go, Well, A, the US Navy, their equivalent to the Soviet frigates is the destroyer escorts, which were not outnumbered 3-1 by any stretch of the imagination. B, the US Navy's frigates outnumbered the Soviets' cruisers. And yeah, it really is complete and utter twaddle. But the thing is, it's the power of a name, and it's politics. So they're all obsessed. And added to that, there is NATO looking over at the US and the United States and going, you know, you're trying to make us all standardise on the same things, right? To ease the logistics burden. Yes. Well, it'd really help us if every time one of your frigates didn't pulled into harbour, you know, and everyone didn't compare it to our frigates, and then go, You're not building that good of frigates, aren't you? They're much smaller than the American frigates. When your frigates are your cruisers. So basically, in 1975, the US Navy sits down and goes, we were free, we were independent, we were our own navy, we were making the world. We had the luster of frigates. We must change. And ships which were destroyer leaders were built as destroyer leaders, designed as destroyer leaders, the destroyer leader hulls, everything, called frigates, become cruisers. Magic of a pen. By the way, in a similar circumstance, the TICOs become guided missile cruisers because the guided missile destroyers that they were going to be were suddenly found to not have the cruisers they were supposed to be backing up because they cancelled the strike cruisers. Which were basically, how can I explain this? The top part of a TICO on a Long Beach sort of style hull with the nuclear power. So people have been asking, because I mean, I put out one of the questions on the Bainbridge and the Truxton class sort of videos which had those ships in. Okay, these points, what they're doing is they're building 1 in 10 of a design nuclear powered. So they basically build 9 ships of the class and then they build a 10th nuclear powered. Imagine what the nuclear version of these ships would have been with the Arleigh Burkes, etc. If you'd done the same. If you'd done, for every 9 nuclear regular Arleigh Burkes, you'd build a 10th nuclear powered. Again, this resulted in many comments about cost, etc. And I was, well, you're right about the cost. This is the thing. I can't argue on the cost argument because you're right. It does cost a lot of money. It's something you do when you have a peer threat. When you don't have a peer threat, you can get away without doing it. But the trouble is, regenerating it when you do have a peer threat is incredibly expensive. Especially when you find yourself with a multi-peer threat, because you have one power which thinks they're still a peer and tries to keep acting like it and being all sorts of bolshy and trying to bully everyone, and another power which thinks it's a peer and is rising as well. And you have to manage both situations so your interests don't get knocked out while they're rising and while they're doing what they're doing. And suddenly you're having to move things backwards and forwards very quickly. Those nuclear cruisers start to look very attractive at a certain point. They really do. So all this takes place. I always feel sorry for the Farragut class. They weren't nuclear powered. But they were these, because they were the smaller frigates, they get, instead of becoming cruisers, they get made destroyers. Just cruel. Now, I would add that there is part of me which is fairly sure, because included in the number of cruisers under construction was, of course, Kirov, which is 28,000 tons fully loaded. So let's go back and have a look. Long Beach, potentially at 15,000 tons, won't look like a bit chipped off. But let's be honest, all the rest are less than half. and some are edging very disturbingly close to a third of their weight. These caused a problem for the United States Navy and for the United States Congress, because the Cold War was incredibly political. It was always going to be political, but it was incredibly political, because it was a battle of ideologies. It was a war of ideology, a war of dreams, for want of a better word. And it still has a legacy to this day. You can't have the political arguments of 50 years shaped by such polarizing factors and not have it still have an effect in your letter politics to this day. It does. And there are many, many legacies, some which people don't even see. Honestly, it's such a part of such an interwoven, such a piece of such a thread interwoven into the fabric of our day-to-day political lives. It's very difficult to see unless you trace back to the origins of that thread, trace it right back to the reel it came from, to the weaver who wove it in. What are these cruisers for? I've just explained. They're basically about strategic utility. But that's not really the only reason you build them. You build them for a few other reasons as well. You want the sheer power they provide. Again, radar systems. There are issues with radars, especially with some of the early radars, in terms of their range. And one of the ways of dealing with those issues was to make them as high up on a ship as possible. Another way of dealing with it, another methodology, was to give them as much power as possible. Again, it's where a nuclear cruiser comes in. And it's what they bring to the table. Nuclear cruisers are about that, and the US Navy's program is about providing them with a sufficient number of escorts that both benefit the pool of nuclear personnel and benefit the rest of the conventional forces personnel as strongly as they can do, whilst providing enough of a distinct capability to justify them. And for roughly 30 years, they do. They justify themselves very well. If you look at their deployment list, Long Beach, the list of deployments she does. I have to admit, one of the problems I see with a lot of them is the lack of helicopter facilities, which they just haven't been built with. And especially when they're double-ended ships, i.e. they have armed missile launchers at both ends. This is a difficult thing to work out how to deal with. Some ships actually go for almost the Russian approach of having lift and hangar. The Ruskies do it, we can do it better. But actually, to be fair to them, the Americans do it better. Or at least slightly more logically for my liking. Long Beach and Bainbridge, when she was a destroyer, or rather a destroyer leader called a frigate, with Enterprise were what sailed around the world. It's an amazing, amazing operation. It's called Sea Orbit. And it's the 1960s equivalent of the White Fleet. But it's not announcing to the world the US Navy has arrived. It's reminding the world the US Navy is here, that the US is here. They are capable, they can go everywhere they need to go. They can reach everywhere they need to reach, and they have the most advanced modern ships of imaginable, nuclear-powered warships. And so if you side with America in this battle of political wills that is coming, that is upon them in the 1960s, they will be able to protect you. They will be able to look after you. You have to remember it's a febrile world, the 1960s. There are a lot of changes taking place. Decolonization is going ahead. A process which was both long overdue and carried out in a rather hurried fashion. That always gets me into trouble, but let me explain. If you think about it, a colonial, it's rather evil to say this, but a colonial power, when they're in charge, what are the institutions they strengthen? The local military, the local police. They're what help them keep control of the local population. So they strengthen those, they educate them, they indoctrinate them in many respects to a certain way of thinking, to a certain form of law and order. Now, some countries already have a very active civil political scene. India, for example. It's an interesting democracy, but it is a democracy. And it already had a political climate going. Yes, it has some interesting patches on it, and still to this day, some interesting legacies. But it functions, and it's there. But many of the countries didn't have that level of political activity already. They had political groups agitating for independence, of course. But they didn't necessarily have the local politics, national politics, all these levels which you need to counterbalance the power of the armed forces and the police. Because if you think about it, a nation state is held together by many pillars. One of the largest pillar, the most important one, is the people and their belief in that nation state. Well, if you have two pillars which are used to working without the nation state and have lost their traditional leadership and power, and there isn't already the power there that used to keep them in check. Because remember, the police and the army used to be kept in check by the colonial power. And that was the other thing. Often, those groups were used to keep the public in check, and the public was scared enough of them, they wanted the colonial power around to keep them in check. That was the balancing act. Well, when that falls apart, goes away, you have issues, and often dictatorships emerge. Not through a fault of the public, through a fault of the colonial system, but also it's an absolute nightmare to work out how to do it. Honestly, you needed probably, before their time, United Nations peacekeeping forces to go in, which sounds terrible. But you almost needed them to be there as a small force, as a token force, to protect the nascent democracy as it grows up from their own military. Where they'd be drawn from, who knows? Probably the sensible idea would be to bring those detachments from other former colonies, militaries, and basically have them all acting as counterbalances to each other. But no one thought about it at the time, and that's off the topic. But it isn't off the topic, because that's a part of the role of these ships. They're going around the world trying to be the US Navy's presence, and the present ships going around, these ships going around, these mighty symbols, are the US Navy trying to fill some of that gap, and the US trying to fill some of that gap to secure allies, to be a stabilizing power. They're trying to step up as the world policeman. And again, that's another reason why they go for frigates. It's an interesting discussion when they're choosing the name frigate, first of all, because what's not said and what is said in the discussion going on and the debate about it, and The book, The Revolt of the Admirals, etc., touches on this in small parts, but not much, because it's mostly about the United States naval aviation, etc. But there are these factors where they're sort of thinking about what kind of luster they want for their force, and what they associate the word frigate with. Trouble is, by this time, everyone else was using it for small anti-submarine warfare escort. Which rather spoiled the whole USN plan. It's terrible, really. Those other nations just get in the way of their plan to have the joy of having frigates. And here's the thing. Honestly, frigates should have been bigger than destroyers. It makes sense. There is a logic to it. Frigate has been around a lot longer in historical terms than destroyer or cruiser. Ah, well. History just keeps coming. The second of the one-ship classes. Well, rather, the one ship spun off from another group of another class. Truxton. Now, she's interesting because she's a single-ended frigate. Or destroyer leader. And single-ended because she only has missile launching capabilities forward. Okay. What does this mean in terms of aircraft? Well, it means she can carry a helicopter. Or rather has the facilities for one. It's nice to have a hangar and a helicopter. It's useful. It allows you to do all sorts of interesting operations. Although, strangely enough, the missile depot was located underneath the helicopter deck. So, they didn't really change that much of the design from from other ships which didn't have the helicopter. So we have the US Navy's cruisers going around the world. And nuclear cruisers are part of that. They're a status symbol. Oh, you turn up with a cruiser, we turn up with a nuclear-powered ship. It's a way to one-up your opponents. They turn up with conventional power, you turn up with nuclear-powered. And the Soviets, as I discussed in the Soviet videos, are going around the world. They are doing the presence mission. That is part of the Soviet modus operandi, to win the peace. Because the peace is about shaping the war. And again, if we go back to that whole decolonization issue and what's going on there, the Soviets are also trying to jump in. It's one of the most interesting ironies going on is that the Soviets, who at that point were merrily building an empire in Europe, because let's be honest, the Warsaw Pact nations were not exactly free and sovereign nations, were they? If anyone wants to argue that, you're more than welcome to. I won't comment in response because I'm fairly sure a lot more people will do. But the point is, they are then going around marketing themselves as the agents of decolonization, as the anti-imperialists. And they have the advantage. They're not allied with the former colonial powers, whereas the US is. Which actually causes the US some issues in some parts of the world. More issues in some than others. More issues in some than others. And you also have the third way nation, France, which is just doing what the French do. But we'll leave that to one side. They dip in and out of NATO, they dip in and out of this, dip in and out of that. It's confusing sometimes. Honestly, the Soviets seem to always presume that if they actually end up in a war with NATO, the French will be fighting them. And that's probably the likely outcome, because I doubt the French would not. Especially after what had happened in World War II. However, NATO is never as sure as the Soviets on that front. So, California. She's a special ship. She really is. Here, representing her class, when she had the new threat upgrade, the NTU, to improve her anti-warfare capability, she lost quite a lot of her anti-submarine warfare capability, and this included disabling her SQS-26 sonar and her ASROC anti-submarine weapons. However, it gave her an anti-air fit, which was probably one of the best in the world at the time when she has it. You have to remember again, there is this traditional sort of thing with technology, in that when something first enters service, it's usually not that good, and when it's been in service for a long time, been upgraded, you're probably getting the best out of it you can. So honestly, it might be better, and is better in this case, than the new thing which comes in service, which is the Aegis system. Because the Aegis system has so many kinks which has to be worked out. It is beyond belief issuing. But with the NTU system put in, etc., the ships, especially the nuclear-powered cruisers, these nuclear-powered vessels, are really frigating capable. They have almost bottomless power as far as the radar is concerned if they want to draw on it. And they have good missiles, the new standard missiles, which are good. And they have the power to do all this stuff and do the operations they need to do. They are excellent command ships. They're excellent ships to deploy places. They are low logistical impact vessels. Because all you have to really do is keep them supplied with food. Fuel for the helicopter. It's always nice to have fuel for the helicopter. They didn't have a hangar, but they had, well, a helicopter deck for the for aircraft, but California and South Carolina did not have a hangar. Interestingly enough, though, California and South Carolina are the two ships decommissioned in 1999. They are the last two ships. The last two nuclear cruisers in the US Navy were the California class. Worthy ships. Again, they were double-ended frigates. Well, double-ended cruisers. They had Mark 13 launchers, fore and aft. And then we have Virginia. Starting to get closer and closer to what is an actual cruiser. Which sounds funny to say, but let's be honest, these are all destroyer leader builds. The difference between them and Long Beach is discernible if you look at their hull shaping and form and the structural inside and various other details. I have seen comments which I cannot comment on because of the criteria given at the front, given at the top of the video. And again, I'm just going to add, because that can sound very pompous at the beginning, that sort of stuff, like I'm saying I'm someone massively important. I'm not. But I'm friends, and I'm, by dint of work and life, in contact with a lot of people who are, in terms of, and they're friends with far more important people who are actually important, probably. So it's that kind of scenario, and believe it or not, you do have to, for some of the realms of war studies and those things, you do have to sign pieces of paper. Although, to be fair, I had to personally sign that when I was much, much younger, because I was doing some, let's call it work experience on a Royal Navy base when I was a teenager. That was actually organised by my mum, not my dad. Anyway. Virginia. Virginia always reminds me of that story because one of the people I was partnered with was actually called Virginia at that time. So I do apologise for the wander off, but it's one of those names. And I love these ships. She is basically a classic example of something which is deployed. She's always deployed. She goes to the Northern Wedding NATO exercise. Oh, good God, I hate that exercise name. Why call it Northern Wedding? Seriously? Who came up with that? Call it Northern Fury. Northern... I know, Northern Wedding does sound like... It's like if the Soviet Union says, we are upset with the NATO's Northern Wedding. That does sound weird. And Northern Fury does sound slightly more intimidating. But couldn't they have gone with Northern Bowling? Northern Ice Hockey? Oh no, they had Canadians onto it. You do not mention Canadian ice hockey around between Canadians and Russians. No, what was I thinking? Anyway. She goes to the Indian Ocean. She spends all sorts of time wandering around parts of the world where you need to have presence. Including, during Operations Desert Shield and Storm, she spends most of the time in the Mediterranean, off the coast of Israel, Lebanon and Syria. I can't think why you wanted one of your best, most powerful radar ships sitting during those Desert Shield and Desert Storm off the coast of Israel, Lebanon and Syria. She commanded a strike group of 4 vessels. USS Spruance, 2 nuclear submarines, Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, as well. And on the 22nd of January 1991, she fired 2 Tomahawk cruise missiles from the Mediterranean to Iraq, which was at that point the longest combat firing of a Tomahawk. She also directed the launching of other Tomahawks, 4 of them, from Spruance and Pittsburgh. Her motto, Sic semper tyrannis. Thus always to tyrants. Rather appropriate for a ship that's fighting a Cold War. Mississippi. Now, I was tempted to do all of Virginia's sisters, but I decided that this video was going to be too long already if I did. And I wanted to give a feel for nuclear cruisers. Now, Mississippi has a very cool career. Okay? She manages to hang around the John F. Kennedy without getting her superstructure taken off. I'm not going to say nuclear power helps in that scenario, but it does give you speed to avoid the Kennedy. Or as I think some people have called it, various other names, which is not nice. Accurate. She then escorted Theodore Roosevelt, which, to arrive on time for Operation Desert Shield, at one point in the 15th of January, I think. Well, she had to break with her conventionally powered battle group upon exiting the Suez Canal, and travelled at flank speed, which is pretty much as fast as they could go, through the Red Sea, through Bab el-Mandab, into the Gulf of Aden. And the reason for the speed was because they weren't quite sure what Yemen was going to do during the war, and so they wanted to get the carrier beyond shore batteries and patrol boats in narrow straits as quickly as possible. Mississippi was the only escort which could keep up with her. All the rest couldn't. So think about that. Today, you couldn't do that. Today, you have to be a tempting target or you don't have an escort. If you're a carrier, you have to go alone. Which also makes you a tempting target. She had an escort. Okay, only one ship, but for Yemen, do you need more than one ship at that time? Again, it's the deterrence thing, it's the presence thing. It's raising the cost of business. If you are going to raise the cost high enough, they won't engage. That's how you manage deterrence. You don't show up with overwhelming force that backs them into a corner and makes them scared. You show up with enough force to raise the cost to the point at which things get dicey. A carrier on its own, well, I've often talked about the fact that carriers, we shouldn't evaluate systems and go, this carrier versus this thing carrying hypersonic missiles. Which wins? Well, it's going to be the carrier battle group and the whole wider force versus the whole wider force. That's what's going to decide the battle, not this 1v1 scenario. Well, if you have the carrier going off on its own, you've made it the 1v1 scenario, and that's not a sensible solution, is it? Unfortunately, there is also something else which comes into existence in the 1980s. And this does, to an extent, explain, I think, some of the processes which happen with the various cruisers, the various nuclear vessels. Because for CGN-42, which was intended to be the first nuclear-powered Aegis cruiser, and was cancelled in 1983, that is the year after the Nunn-McCurdy Amendment. Now, that program had started to edge over budget. Mainly because it had been in development process for quite a while, and if we consider Virginia was laid down in 1972, Texas 73, Mississippi 75, Arkansas 77, and CGN 42 hadn't been laid down yet when she's cancelled in 1983. Yeah, I'm fairly sure cost has gone up. Because people have been, A, waiting on Aegis, and B, working out what they want to fit and keep changing their minds, and it's slowly evolving into basically the strike cruiser. And also there's the problem of working out how you're going to fit Aegis onto the Virginia hull. Because the Virginia hull, it turns out, is a destroyer leader hull, and for the size of Aegis you want to put on it, vis-a-vis the nuclear power, with the power you're going to get from the reactors, you actually need something which is more likely a Long Beach hull. But Nunn-McCurdy Amendment is sensible, but you now have to make sure your programs, if they're going to go over cost, are essential to national security, are without a suitable alternative of lesser cost available, and the new estimates of total program costs are reasonable, and management structure is made adequate to control costs. Well, the last two are subjective, let's be honest. What is a reasonable cost for a cruiser to me might not be the same as a reasonable cost to a cruiser for you. No suitable alternative of lesser cost is available. Well, at this time, when they're talking about it, there are these other nuclear cruisers in service, so the advantage of that thing with Theodore Roosevelt, A, it hasn't happened yet, and B, it's a theoretical. Yes, they've done sea orbit, they've done various operations, they've done various emergency moves of carriers around the world, but, nothing's ever happened, no one's ever done anything, so, perhaps we're just being overzealous. And we've got these ships already in service, so why do we need others? The program is essential to national security. Well, Aegis is the new cool thing. You're building all these Aegis ships. And by the way, in 1980, of course, well, a certain class of vessels become cruisers, don't they? In 1980, 1st of January 1980, TICO class guided missile destroyers become guided missile cruisers. So why do you need two classes of cruisers being built? We're not the Soviet Union. We're America. We're sensible. Hoisted by their own petards. And then, of course, you have the fights within the Navy. Rickover has always seen, and always did see, the nuclear surface fleet as a threat to his power and his status. He couldn't do anything about carriers. He really couldn't. They're too big, they're too powerful, they're too important to the sense of American national identity post-World War II. He had to live with them. But surface ships, oh, he could hobble those. And you can justify, based on the capabilities it provides, a nuclear submarine, yes. A nuclear carrier, yes. Without mentioning the fact that without the nuclear escort, one of the key capabilities of your nuclear carrier, one of its key advantages over its conventional counterparts, is lost. Because it doesn't have the... A carrier is part of a battle group. It's part of a battle group. Without a battle group, without the protection of the battle group on the battle group without the protection of the carrier, they don't work. They are both each other's strike power and each other's defensive power. You combine them all together, they are an unstoppable warfighting machine. It's one of the reasons why I laugh when people say, oh, you know, you don't need this, you don't need that. They're always salami slicing off components of the machine. The thing is, you need the whole. The whole is what makes it work. If you have less than the whole, then you're going to be able to do less things. A lot less things. You can't do more with less. You really can't. I know British governments have believed that for it feels like centuries, but really since about, I would say 1904, 1903. There's a reason why Jackie Fisher has to sell the Royal Navy on the government on building one dreadnought for the Royal Navy, not ordering a sensible batch of 4. There is a reason for that. So, nuclear-powered cruisers. These, of course, are the strike cruisers. That's the ideas for them. They do look like a TICO, but actually properly proportioned. Everything looks in actual proportion to their size. The superstructure doesn't look like it's about to bust off the side of the ship. Double-ended, but with hangar. You can imagine those ships could have been adapted to VLS quite easily. They're going to have a deep hull. But they weren't to be. The program was cancelled. Peace dividend. No peer war. Too expensive. Too expensive in personnel. Really? You're still having to keep all those personnel going through. You're still having to train a large batch of personnel anyway to keep the carriers going, to keep the submarines going. Honestly, the surface ships were a very small part of it, but yes, they were leveling off some personnel, but they were also giving you some more experienced personnel in nuclear power. Which, if you think about it, is useful, because if you have a carrier which has a nuclear cruiser which is a nuclear escort, if you have, let's say, a disease outbreak on the carrier, and let's be honest, these ships are closed systems. We've seen in recent times what happens if a disease gets aboard them. You could have a lot of people incapacitated very quickly. Well, you then worry about that carrier's reactor. Those reactors need to be watched. If you have another ship with you which has a nuclear crew, those are extra watch people. Yes, they are not acquainted with the chemistry of your reactors, because every reactor has a different chemistry. Yes, there are differences, but they've still got a far better start than everyone else in around, and they are far closer if you have problems, if you need extra personnel quickly to come and help out, to cover while you sort things out. They're close. They can come in their decon suits, get off a helicopter, go to where they are, man the post, and then go back. So, points of discussion. Well, I'm hoping this video has started off several points of discussion. And I'm hoping it's not all going to be about colonization, but on decolonization, but a lot of it was structured in there because that's part, and the Cold War are part of the political background of these ships. The competitions, the images going around are part of the reality of these ships being built. It's sometimes difficult to put across because the people who are interested in these things find those sort of ideas absurd because, well, there's no substance to them. But the people who are interested in understanding these things would never have had the 1974 Soviet cruiser gap crisis. They wouldn't have. And if you think about that, that was with a United States Senate full of people who were veterans of World War II. 1974. Less than 20 years since World War II was over. Average age of a senator, what, 60? So they would have been service personnel, a large number of them, during World War II. You think they would have learned to bother less about the name of things than the reality of the capability of the vessel they're talking about. But no. They have a full tiswas over it. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you found it interesting. So, points of discussion. Well, there's a reason I chose HMS Renown as the image for the cover on this video. Because of the Kirros, the last remaining nuclear cruisers in the world. Well, last remaining one is... Technically, Peter Velicky has a sister, but technically when she actually comes into service, instead of being in permanent refit, then I will start counting her. Probably be renamed again before she does that. But leaving that to one side, the point is these vessels were nuclear powered for a reason. To give a capability. They were expensive, yes. They cost, yes. But they were there because of the real world peer war threat. Peer conflict justifies a lot of things which might not be justified in different circumstances. So the discussion I'd like to see in the comments below is what other things and what things you think were cut for cost reasons. But the full point is not it costs too much. But instead it costs too much when the threat of peer-on-peer conflict is now over because we've won. I think there are a lot of things across the board, not just in services, but in terms of science and approaches to educational sorts of things, that were cut because we've won, so we don't need to. We can save money. We don't need to invest it. Which is a strange thing when you think about the entire capitalist financial model is based on investment. And it is. The whole idea at its base point is people investing money to grow the means of production, to empower the entrepreneurs to generate more money that can be invested again and keep in going in a virtuous circle, ever growing pot of money. That's the theory. So what I've got coming up. Well, this is getting towards the end of the Christmas video, isn't it? It really is. This is the 30th. Tomorrow's the TCO class. US treaty cruisers in war in retrospect. 100 years of gun cruisers coming up, long patrol. I've recorded all the insect class, top 5 inventions, all those already. I have got to record tomorrow TCO, treaty cruisers, and 100 years of gun cruisers. Wish me luck. It's nearly 1 AM. But I want to get this all done this week because next week is absolutely hectic for me. Thank you for all your support. I wouldn't have made it through doing all this history in 2022 without you. I certainly wouldn't have made it to Canada. There is no chance of me making Australia without your support. Thank you very much for everything you've done for me. I really wouldn't be here without it. And I hope, for those of you who have been lonely this Christmas, these videos have been helpful and least enjoyable. For those of you who haven't been lonely but have had much Christmas cheer but have still enjoyed breaks with listening to videos, these videos have been helpful, and I hope you've enjoyed them, and I hope you've, I don't want to say something pompous like learnt something, but I hope you found something of interest in them. That's why I do them. Thank you very much for watching. Take care, and good night.